Hey everyone. This is a weird time for the world, isn't it? In this era of heightened tension between civilians, especially black ones with law enforcement, it's important to understand how the media we consume can affect our perceptions of them. With this, I'm not trying to change your mind or treat my word as gospel. To be honest, as I'm writing this, I'm not even sure how I feel. But this is a necessary conversation to have. Hell, they even cancelled Paw Patrol, so I don't think any media is immune to this conversation. Brooklyn Nine-Nine is a sitcom about a lovable goofball, Detective Jake Peralta and his colleagues doing their detective thing in Brooklyn. Together, the guys get into all sorts of shenanigans while awesomely putting away bad guys, or so it goes. So, what's the problem here? Is Brooklyn Nine-Nine overtly problematic? What is this show doing wrong? Even Andy Samberg himself says the show's just a feel-good network sitcom, so is this even worth talking about? Well, for a lot of people, yeah. To examine why, we must go over the idea of Copaganda. Well, to put it simply, Copaganda is messaging in the media that intentionally or unintentionally humanizes cops and paints them as heroes, leaving the consumer to potentially view cops in a more positive light than they normally would. Now, whether you consider this to be harmless or not is up to you, but when hearing my arguments, you must understand that a lot of people don't trust cops, and in my opinion, they're justified in that position. Even just recently, we're seeing cops cover their badge numbers and straight up abuse civilians in the streets while they exercise their rights to peacefully protest. As it stands right now, cops aren't given adequate training to expertly handle the laundry list of tasks that they're expected to do. They're given too much power, aren't trained well enough to wield that power, and face little consequences when they abuse that power. So when civilians are apprehensive about watching a wholesome show about cops being model citizens, I think that's fair. So on that note, let's cut to the chase already. Where is this supposed Copaganda? Well, let's start with the characters. From the beginning, there's a pretty clear dichotomy between the behaviors of the so-called model cops and bad cops. Our protagonists are pretty much never seen breaking the law, and they have a rigorous standard for their moral code, and they're never depicted as bad people. When compared to these so-called bad cops, the viewer might assume that those are just bad apples, or so the saying goes. Let's go over some examples of these juxtapositions. One of the main antagonists in the show is the Vulture, a guy who's notorious for swooping in and solving cases right as they're about to be solved so he can get the credit for it. Throughout the show, he's made to look like an objectively bad person. One example is when he's their interim captain, he takes all major cases and gives them away to his home squad so they can get the credit so he can win a bet. He's constantly sexist and generally gross to the female characters here, and he also abuses his power by threatening to fire Peralta if he doesn't break up with his girlfriend as well. Our protagonists clearly hate this guy. He's obviously meant to not look intelligent or even competent, so our law-abiding good citizen protagonist cops look pretty good by comparison, don't they? Now, I don't know if it's just me, but this really begs the question, how did this guy even get here in the first place? Even worse, how has he been allowed to move up in the ranks if he's so outwardly bad to everyone he meets? And the most pressing question of them all is this intentional? Is this supposed to be some sort of commentary on how good cops are supposed to be versus bad cops? Is this meant to be a commentary on the biased institutions that got him there? Also, the Vulture seems to be pretty familiar with sexual harassment guidelines, his words, not mine. How is he still working here? These great people not decided, I don't know, to maybe stop him so he doesn't ruin someone else's life due to negligence? Well, that's for you to decide. Let's go over another example. Another instance is Captain Stentley. From the very beginning, this guy's obviously meant to be comic relief. The guy walks into his first meeting in sweatpants, literally says he doesn't know how he became captain, and lets the entire squad bitch him around so he doesn't have to do any real work. This ends up coming to them in the form of needless purchases for the entire squad. One detective gets some walls around her desk so people can't bug her. The captain's assistant hires a secondary assistant to do all of her assistant work for her, and then hires another one to help that assistant manage her workload. Also, the sergeant gets a custom yogurt fridge, and you get the idea. Sooner or later, one of the detectives ends up convincing these guys, rightly so, that they're all behaving extremely irresponsibly and should be ashamed of themselves. They eventually return these things. This is played for laughs, but I don't know, this isn't as funny as like stealing pens from your office, is it? This is the taxpayer directly paying for things that have nothing to do with enforcing the law, but I digress. Maybe I'm being too critical. One joke they make with Captain Stentley is how grossly incompetent he is. The guy straight up lost, in his words, a football's worth of cocaine. That was supposed to be used for evidence, and he ruins an undercover op, plays bongos in his office instead of doing actual police work, and he's stated to have been in the academy for 9 years as opposed to the regular 6 months. And once again, he let the squad blow a lot of money on leisure spending. Is this meant to also be a commentary? After all, he ends up getting a Medal of Honor for literally doing nothing. Also, if Amy didn't convince the squad to return their stuff, would they have kept it at the expense of the taxpayer? The entire thing is played as a joke, but I wonder how much they were trying to comment on departmental spending. Captain Stentley, despite all these things, has only moved up in the ranks. If these detectives all live by such a strict and rigid moral code, why hasn't anyone tried to get this guy fired? So we can see, Brooklyn Nine-Nine has showed us, the audience, pretty evidently that there's a distinction between good cops and bad cops. But even worse, in my opinion, is there's certain characters partaking in legitimately awful behavior and still being one of the lovable goofball characters that the show wants them to be. I know I'm beating a dead horse here because everybody's already brought this up, but the captain's assistant Gina constantly sexually harasses her sergeant in ways that he's clearly uncomfortable, telling him to take off his clothes. I'm pretty sure she even tries to touch him constantly, and this is played as a joke. Another example, oh boy, I'm gonna say it, Hitchcock is a fucking terrible person. This guy, from the beginning, is meant to be this funny, gross guy along with his friend Scully, but he's so much worse than that, and the show somehow thinks that this is funny. Hitchcock is seen in some very strange relationships. Even his colleagues are confused about his relationships being with women that are young enough to be his daughter. He's always in the women's washroom, drives a creeper van, and has his own creep kits that are obviously used to stalk women, and sexualizes fellow Detective Diaz super often. Bro, there's an instance here where Detective Diaz is seen lacing Detective Peralta's water with caffeine pills, and Hitchcock walks by and gives an approving head nod. Does that not sound really fucking bad to you? I mean, think of the implications of what's going on here. Is Hitchcock watching somebody drug another person with unknown pills and nodding in approval? This entire dynamic is played for laughs. I mean, how is this guy even a cop? How have his colleagues not reported this guy yet? In the first season, Sergeant Jeffords is shown to not be allowed back onto the field unless he passes a psyche eval. He's really on edge, and as the show makes it abundantly clear, he'll pretty much shoot anything that moves. After he goes for a psyche eval, he's shown to be very unstable and unhinged. However, when he hears that his squad's in danger, he stamps his own form with approval and runs out onto the scene and saves the day. I'm not sure what happened to him after this because, he passed himself for an exam. But this just reaffirms the idea of a cop hunch. I mean, what would happen if a legitimately deranged or ignorant person did this, got to the scene, and then shot a person after he cleared himself? We as the audience will never know the answer to this question because the show never confronts these good cops with this sort of decision. From hearing these examples alone, you might think that these people are all terrible or that I'm cherry picking, and I will say, however, these incidents generally are few and far between. Let's look at some examples of how these people are supposedly good cops as well. Hitchcock and Scully seem to have forgotten to take a witness's name down during an investigation, leading to some pretty wide confusion. At the end of the show, you find out that they intentionally left the section blank because the witness was undocumented and ICE would probably get them if their info was on file. Fuck ICE, by the way. Detective Boyle somehow has ended up in a hostage situation where his ex-wife has the last of his sperm and he wants it so he can have a child with this new girl because now he's unable to. However, his ex is a horrible person and she hit an elderly pedestrian with her car and is now being sued by him. She makes him go and blackmail him under the pretense of being a cop so that he can drop his charges, but Peralta eventually stops him because that's a direct abuse of power. Although, I mean, Boyle was still in the force after trying to do this, so whatever. Anyways, another example is that Captain Holt finds out that the role for police commissioner was being picked by a bunch of old dudes who don't want a woman in power, saying that they only put her in the running for PR reasons. He immediately dropped out of the race, saying that he'll only run if he can win fairly. But here's the thing, I mean, are cops really like this? Are these so-called bad cops here just bad apples? Or are they representing a system of fundamental flaws that allow for these sorts of things to happen? What does Brooklyn Nine-Nine have to say about this? Well, I guess that depends. I mean, see, here's the thing. Brooklyn Nine-Nine is most likely aware of the connotations involved. The show, in my opinion, tries pretty often to depict the darker side of police, which I think is a little unique compared to other police glory shows. For example, Sergeant Jeffords is seen here being racially profiled by an obviously crooked cop for being in black in a good neighborhood. He tries to talk to him about it after and show him where he went wrong, and the cop just acts like a dick about it. After filing a complaint about him, it's speculated whether Sergeant Jeffords was turned down for a future promotion or not because of this, but we never end up finding out. So, once again, what's the problem here? The show isn't trying to convince us that all cops are good, are they? I mean, it's not really that simple though. Oftentimes, like in previous examples, we see the cops that are obviously meant to be bad. They're meant to show us what a bad cop looks like. They're very archetypal in that way. But compare them to our great protagonists here, these are obviously depicted to be way worse than what the standard is, so they're pretty much bad apples here. So this raises another question. Is Brooklyn Nine-Nine trying to be accurate or not? If it is it trying to do a good enough job of bringing light to these issues, or is it just doing the bad apples thing again? Let's go into some more in-depth examples to maybe get a better idea. One episode I've enjoyed in the past features the singer Kid Cudi, who apparently has a criminal history with Peralta in this show. This entire episode, even though I really enjoyed it in the past, is pretty problematic. This episode starts off with a dilemma. Peralta has arrested Cudi for a crime with zero evidence, and legally he has 48 hours to find evidence or he loses the arrest, the department gets sued, and everyone gets mad at him. Peralta then goes on a mad dash to find evidence of a crime, but the thing is, I don't really get the vibe that these guys are mad at him for doing something morally questionable. Jake arrested this guy for the sole reason that he antagonized him, and while it was a really good joke, it seems like some really thin ice to be treading on, don't you think? The entire episode, we're reminded of how much Jake simply inconvenienced his colleagues, and that poor Amy's gonna miss out on her date, and people are tired. This, for some reason, seems to completely gloss over the idea that these guys are on a wild goose chase to prove that some guy that they don't like is guilty. And here's the thing. Yeah, he's a former criminal, so it stands to reason he is likely to commit another crime, but is Brooklyn Nine-Nine commenting here on how ineffective jail is as a reformative system? I don't think so. Is this potentially innocent man being held in custody for 48 hours under the simple premise that Peralta wants to rescue his colleague's date? Given that the show makes no mention of this, I can't think that this is aimed to be some sort of commentary and it's just supposed to be funny. For me, all this scene does is reaffirm the idea of a cop hunch, or once a criminal, always a criminal, and that just doesn't sit right with me. To me, it looks like this show is trying its best to humanize cops. You know, you got this lovable, goofy idiot, this gay cop who wants to fix his community, this black sergeant with 2 kids at home, you know, the list goes on. Personally, the worst offense for me takes place in the 7th season. This episode, I'm not gonna lie, I feel pretty fucking strongly about this one. A newly introduced eccentric officer named Debbie is accused of stealing cocaine from the evidence lockup for a well-known crime boss. Debbie, however, is pretty obviously a fucking idiot. She makes it pretty obvious that it was her, and when Detective Diaz and Peralta convince her that they're criminals so they can secretly find out where the boss is, she kinda just believes it and lets them tag along. She then does a stupid amount of that cocaine and points 2 submachine guns at the detectives. Diaz tries to apprehend her, and then Debbie beats her up and ties her. Debbie then forces Diaz into the trunk of her car, does more cocaine, and then drives them to her house where she eventually takes everyone hostage. We then, however, find out that Debbie was doing all of this to get money to pay for her dad's surgery, which, okay, it makes sense then. But here's the thing, it really doesn't. She didn't need to do the cocaine, she didn't need to operate a vehicle under the influence of that cocaine, she didn't need to beat up 2 officers, she didn't need to take them hostage, she really didn't need to do any of this. The mafia boss in question is notorious, so he's probably already familiar with murdering people. Should cops be allowed to steal evidence and sell it to that person for personal gain? No, see, this isn't as cookie cutter as stealing bread to feed your family. This is selling convicting evidence to a crime boss for $1 million, which you then use for an experimental surgery. Side note, we end up finding out that her brother ended up paying for the surgery anyways, so this whole thing was pointless. Now, the problem here especially is that Peralta continuously sympathizes with her. Oh, she has a lot of pressure. Oh, she's just doing this to pay for her dad's surgery. Oh, she did cocaine because... why? Eventually, even Diaz ends up caping for her by getting her sentence reduced from 30 years to 10. So, what is Brooklyn Nine-Nine trying to say here? Are they saying that even our model cops can be biased? I don't think so. This sounds like a pretty good thing that happened. Before I continue on with this, let me go off topic for a second. I promise it's relevant. So, some people may be watching this and thinking in their head, big deal. This show isn't meant to be taken seriously, it's just a comedy. Don't think about it, it'll be fine. But is that a good thing? Do we want TV to constantly make us ignore legitimate criticisms of American police under the guise that it's not that serious? Could this potentially lead to an implicit bias that sees cops positively? Or even better question, does the show even want us to do this? I mean, oftentimes the show is praised for its depiction of societal flaws, like the aforementioned racial profiling incident. Another thing the show does is challenge stigmas and concerns over character sexuality after Detective Diaz comes out as bisexual. For many, these are probably pretty eye-opening, and the show is often praised for these types of scenes for shedding light on important social issues. However, doesn't that contradict the claims that it isn't that serious? I mean, why would a lighthearted feel-good sitcom touch on these issues at all then? Well, the answer's probably already in your head, and it's that a show about cops is almost obligated to do this or it'll get cancelled. I mean, if it doesn't, it's pretty much overt Copaganda. The problem that plagues not just Brooklyn Nine-Nine but all cop shows is that many would argue that it has a social responsibility to paint a picture of both sides, and not just the people we like versus the people that they don't. So, back to what I was saying earlier. Is the Debbie situation an example of police bias, or is this just an intentional attempt to humanize this cop for an objectively bad series of decisions they made? For me, this invites a few questions. 1. Would they have given the same type of consideration for a civilian who was selling weed to feed their family? Would they have tried to reduce their prison sentence then? 2. Does this take place in the same universe as the one we live in today, where unarmed innocent black civilians are murdered well before they have a chance to go to prison? How would these detectives react here? Are people only allowed to break the rules when they're cops? My personal issue lies in the fact that, for me to cast aside all of this, I more or less have to treat Brooklyn Nine-Nine as a fantasy show. When watching the show, I have to constantly remind myself, like, this is so far from the truth. Real life doesn't have a majority good apple, minority bad apple system in law enforcement, and we're seeing the brunt of that right now. So the most pressing question after all of this is, what should we do here? Do we stay blissfully ignorant to this, or do we acknowledge the deep-rooted history of what's going on here? Personally, I think that's your choice to make. At the end of the day, Brooklyn Nine-Nine is probably the most self-aware cop show I've ever seen, and for some people that's enough. For me, as long as you're aware that this is Copaganda, I still think it's very possible to enjoy this show. What the show does in a lot of aspects is it puts its characters in some pretty favorable positions. The characters have never been expected to shoot someone unless it's a joke, and no character has had to confront the reality of having to maybe kill somebody. For some, Brooklyn Nine-Nine may be trying to lead by example and show cops what they need to be doing to be the community heroes that they probably want to be. I mean, the main issue with this show, honestly, it's just its setting. A lot of the funny things that happen in the show are good not because it's a cop show, but because the characters are good. The chemistry between these actors is amazing, and a lot of the jokes are legitimately funny to me, and these amazing characters just kind of happen to be cops. Some may ask then, what would you do to fix this? Show videos of black people being brutalized? I mean, like, make the characters less likable in an effort to make them realistic, therefore making the show less funny? I mean, honestly, dude, I don't know. I'm not a writer. I don't know the legalities of how this works, and I don't know the ins and outs of completely revamping a show. But I do think it's possible, in a very self-aware way, to have these characters in a different setting. How exactly? Man, I don't fucking know. But I do trust that in this era of tensions with civilians and police, that Brooklyn Nine-Nine doesn't just pretend that it exists in a vacuum. I hope that it doesn't completely ignore or gloss over the unfair murders that were committed by people just like our characters, or that the legal system is busted enough to let things like this happen with little consequence. Anyways, that's it for me. Honestly, I'm still kind of torn exactly how I feel. I hope that the show kind of picks this up and, puts it in a positive direction and is still aware of what's going on around it. Make no mistake, I still watch this show, but I wanted to kind of build a conversation about it because I think this is a conversation worth having, like I said. So, if you have any ideas on anything I missed, or if you think I'm being biased, or if you agree, whatever you want, just, let's talk about it. Let's have a conversation. Yeah, that's it for me. See you guys later. Black Lives Matter.